Hi, my name is Oliver, and in this video I'll teach you how to animate a game character run cycle in After Effects. So the first part is illustrating the game character. Now Among Us has been very popular lately, and therefore I've illustrated one of their characters, which is this quite simple bean looking dude. And I'll quickly walk you through the steps I took to create this illustration. So let's start with the body. You can see at the top here it's completely rounded, and at the bottom it's just a bit square with some rounded edges. And this is just so the legs have some space to move around. And then I've also cut out some of the stroke down here, and I'll show you in a bit why I've done that. Now the way that I've added the shading is essentially that I just took the first body part here, which is just sort of the simple shape. Then I added the shading on top. And then at last I added the stroke on top, so the shading is hidden underneath the stroke. Now after this I've just added the visor, and I've just done it the same way with the shading, so that's quite simple. Then I have the backpack here that he's carrying, or the sort of oxygen container. And now we've come to the legs, which is sort of the most complicated part for this sort of animation. So as you can see, here's the left leg and here's the right leg. Now these are without strokes, and I'll show you why that is in just a second. And basically these are just simple paths, so they're easy to animate and we don't need to rig them or anything like that. It's quite easy to set up. Now in between the legs I've added an overlay to the body, which is essentially just this sort of stroke here. And you can see that this just creates some depth, because you can see that the left leg is on top and the right leg is on the bottom. So this is just sort of to define the dimensionality in the illustration. Now to add the strokes to the legs, I have simply just duplicated the path and made it that same stroke color. And then I've basically just made it a larger stroke, so it sort of fits with the outline here. And that way you can see that when we do that for both legs, we have this character. And then if we select both paths here, you can see that when we move the leg around, it looks like the stroke is following perfectly, and also when we move it to the left. So this is basically the character, and then I've just added a shadow at the bottom. If you want to support the channel, you can go down in the description and download the project file for this tutorial. It contains all of my keyframes and easings, so you can get some inspiration from that, as well as the entire character within After Effects, so you can rig it yourself and try to animate it and learn some character animation. Before we get started animating, I quickly want to mention the sponsor of this video, which happens to be Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform which has thousands of courses covering all of the creative fields such as illustration, design, video editing, and most importantly, animation. I can personally recommend the course on Animating with Ease by Jake Bartlett, which covers the essentials of how to use the graph editor properly, as well as Fraser Davison's course on simple character animation, which was my very first introduction to that subject. If you want to learn about text animation, I've also created a course on animating text using shape layers, which goes into the depths of squash and stretch, as well as a retro 80s text course for a more stylized look. Right now, the first 500 people that click the link in the description will get their 2 first months of Skillshare Premium for free. So getting this into After Effects is actually quite simple. So I've just found my file here and dragged it into After Effects. And then I have to make sure that I've chosen a composition and not just footage, and that way you get access to all of the different layers. So click OK, and here you can see we have the character. So now we want some of these layers to be shape layers, and that's basically just the legs. And the reason why is because we want to adjust the paths so we can actually animate the legs. Therefore, we'll just find all of the leg layers. So you can see we have the leg left, leg right, and then we have these strokes for both of the legs. Then we just right click, create, and then create shapes from vector layers. So now we can just delete the sort of hidden Illustrator layers here. And that way you can see that we have the paths that are ready to be animated. And now if you were to change anything in this illustration, you could basically just change it up here in Illustrator, save the file, and it would also change here, except for the legs, because you have already converted them to shape layers. So when working with character animation, we have a lot of layers. And with this workspace, we're not really able to see all of them. So I want to adjust that. We'll start out by moving the composition to the right side. So move it over here. Then we want our timeline to be all the way to the left. And then we just want to drag everything we have here, the align effects and everything like that, below the project tab. And that way it's just more neatly organized. Then we can simply drag this in so we don't have that much visible of our layer names, and we don't really need to see the entire name of everything, so that should work fine. And basically we don't need that much space for this in the center because we're not really going to use it that much in this project. So we can basically just drag that in like this, and then we have a lot more space to work with. So now we want to rig this character, and we want to attach most parts to the main body. So this is stuff like the sweat, visor, the overlay for the body. Then we have the backpack, and just pick whip that to the body. That way when we move it, you can see that everything moves with it, except for the legs. And that's the reasoning behind this. Now if we select the body, we just want to adjust the anchor point down to the hip. So we'll select the pan behind tool, simply just drag that down like this. And we want to be able to rotate the body. And we can't really do that if we have the legs parented to it, because you can see that if we start to parent a leg to the body, that rotates with it, and we don't want that. Therefore, we need a main controller for the body for the movement that goes up and down. So we'll go to Layer, New, Null Object, and we'll just call this the controller. And this controller basically needs to control everything. So we take anything that's not parented. This is stuff like the legs and the body, and we just parent that to the controller. That way when we move this, you can see that everything moves up and down with it. So this is great, and therefore we can rotate the body and use the controller to sort of move the body up and down. Now we need to rig the legs, and this is quite simple. The only thing we need to do is sort of link the strokes with the main legs. You can see that if we open up one of the legs right here and go into the path, if we try to adjust that path, the underlying stroke won't really follow it. But that's quite an easy fix for this. We just select all of the leg layers, then go up in the search bar and search for path. Then you can see this is the left underlying stroke. So we alt option click that path, drag that up to the left leg, and do the same for the right leg, like this. Now for some reason the underlying strokes may move, but we can easily fix that by just zooming in here. Then we select both of the underlying strokes and simply just readjust the positioning so they fit again, sort of like this. And now if you were to take one of the main paths and move them around, you can see that the underlying stroke follows and you get this cool animation. Now we can start to animate the character, and we want a bit of space before and after the animation so we can loop it properly. Therefore we can perhaps go 10 frames ahead, and then we can press B to trim the work area. And then I want this to last 16 frames, so we'll go 16 frames ahead. And press N to trim the work area again. So I've started by blocking out the position and rotation of the body. Now you can see this is just where you take the key positions and you create whole keyframes by right clicking, going to toggle whole keyframe, and that way it doesn't interpolate between the keyframes, it just jumps to that next value. And this is quite a simple animation, as you can see. Here at the first point we just have him down on the ground and his body is rotated a bit forward. Then we go 4 frames ahead and you can see that he's now lifted up, so he's sort of in mid jump. This is also what you do in a run cycle, you sort of jump a bit with your body, and then he's also rotated a bit backwards, he's leaning back. So you can see this is just repeated, and here at the end it sort of ends at the start position, so you can see we have 5 key positions. Now in terms of the rotation, you can make that a lot more interesting if you just select all of the keyframes and nudge them 1 frame to the right. That way you just offset the animation a bit and you can see it's a bit more fluid, but of course this is just the planning stage, and this is where you sort of plan the timing between the keyframes and everything, and that way you can also see if it works out before you start doing the entire easing. So now I've animated one of the legs, and the reasoning behind this is that you can just take that leg afterwards, duplicate it, place it on the other side and offset it, so that way you don't have to animate them separately, and by doing it this way you also get a much more similar animation between the legs. So this also consists of 5 key poses. So the first key pose is sort of the contact pose. You can see that the leg is moved a bit forward, completely straight, touching the ground. And the ground is just marked with a ruler. You can drag a ruler out by pressing Command and Control R. just dragging one out. And really, this is where his leg is touching the ground, so he's moved down with his body, and he's ready to move the leg backwards. So when we go to the next key pose, you can see it does exactly that. He sort of jumps up. So the way I've adjusted this path to make it bend is that I've just gone up here. You can see within the pen tool, I've selected the convert vertex tool. That way you can drag out the path and bend it however you'd like. So his leg is sort of all the way back. Then for the next key pose, this is sort of the passing position. He's ready to move that leg forward quickly, and then he moves it forward. So you can see the passing position is essentially when he's touching the ground. He's just going to be touching the ground with the other leg. So you can see he goes down, up, down. And then for the next one, his leg is all the way forward. It's a bit bent. And then at last, he hits the ground again. And this is just to make the loop. So that way you can see that he's running. And now we want to duplicate this animation for the right leg. So we'll just take all of these keyframes and copy them. Then go to the right leg and find the path. Then we can paste it onto that path. And you can see that we have the same animation on both legs. And this looks sort of like a horse, I would say. This could also work out. It looks quite silly, to be honest, and we just want to adjust it so they are offset from each other. That means that if we go to a position where the left leg is all the way back, we want the right leg to be all the way forward. So you can do this by taking the keyframes and just dragging them so the first keyframe is in the center position. Then we want the animation to start with the same keyframe that it ended with. So therefore we can take the last 3 keyframes, copy them, go to the very start, and then just paste it. So this way you can see that we have the running animation, and actually you could move between the keyframes quite easily if you hadn't offset this body rotation. So if we drag that back, then you can move to the next keyframe by pressing K and move backwards by pressing J. So that just gives an easy overview of the animation, but of course we want that bit of offset in our body rotation. So now we'll ease the entire thing, and at first this will look quite janky, but we'll fix that, don't worry. So select all of the keyframes and press F9 to ease them. And if we preview this, it looks sort of alright, but there's just a few things that I would like to change. Now first of all, you can see that when the legs go on top of each other, we have a tiny mistake. You can see the stroke is disappearing from the left leg. So we can fix this by selecting the left stroke. So this is the stroke behind it. Duplicating that by pressing Command and Control D. And then we want to move it on top of the right leg, so right here. But now you can see it becomes visible up here. So we want to fix that. We'll go up and select the tool creates mask, select the rectangle tool, and that way we can just drag out what we want to be visible. So just drag out a rectangle like this. And then whenever the leg sort of moves on top there, it maintains the stroke. So that's great. Let's start out by easing the body movement up and down. So we'll go into the graph editor, and here you can see that we have this graph. This is the Y position we're working with here. So when that's all the way down, that means the body is up, and when it's all the way up, that means the body is down. So that's quite simple. Now we want it to have this very springy motion, which means that it needs a lot of hang time in the air. So we want the easing to be concentrated on these 2 points. So if we select both of them and drag them out to both sides, they will get a lot more hang time in the air. And now you have to only focus on the body because the legs are looking a bit weird right now, but we'll fix that next. So in terms of the legs, whenever you get to a passing position like this one, you simply just don't want it to stop all the way and slow all the way down. You want it to move through that keyframe, so continue with a constant speed. And the way you can do that is by using something called Auto Bezier. So select the keyframes, hold down Command and Control, and click 2 times, and you get these round keyframes. And if you go into the graph editor, and we have the speed graph selected here, you can see that they are just moving at a constant speed here throughout that keyframe. And otherwise, if they're all the way down here, they would come to a complete stop. So what this essentially does is just make the animation a lot smoother. And really, when you're in a passing position, your legs don't stop, they just move through it. And we also have a passing position here at the end, as well as the start. That's sort of the same position. So you can select those keyframes and again click 2 times with Command and Control held down. And you can see it already becomes a lot smoother. And now we just want to exaggerate this, because as you can see right now the body is really exaggerated when it's moving up and down, but the legs are not really that exaggerated. So we'll select all of the keyframes, go into the graph editor, and here you can see we want them to quickly move to this outer position and sort of hang there for a bit longer before swinging through. So to do this, we simply select these keyframes down here. This is the position where they are all the way out, all the way in. And then we just add a bit of easing to both sides, like this, and you can drag them up so they roughly align up here at top. And that way you can just see that it's a bit more exaggerated. And this is really what we're looking for. And you can exaggerate this as much as you'd like, and I think I'll just keep it at this for now. And last but not least, let's add a bit of easing to this rotation. So we'll go in here, and here we'll select the value graph. That's just easier to work with. And we just want to select all keyframes and drag them in a bit so it's just eased a tiny bit more. But now you can see one problem we have is that here towards the end, we don't get that last keyframe, and also we don't have it here at the start. So we basically want that to loop in. So we'll Alt Option click the rotation, type in loop in, parenthesis, and then a semicolon. And that way it should look a lot smoother and it should loop perfectly. Now as a final detail, I've just scaled up and down the shadow. So you can see when it's touching the ground, the shadow is the largest. And then when it moves upwards, the shadow becomes smaller because the character is now a further distance from that ground. So this just adds a bit more to the animation and makes it a bit more interesting. So now we can just smoothen out these impacts by creating some squash and stretch. So whenever the body hits the ground, we want it to squash down. So we can just go to the very start, select the body here, and then we press S as in scale, add a keyframe, and we just want to go, let's say, 3 frames before it sort of hits the ground here. So 1, 2, 3. So we can maybe go for 95 in the vertical scale. And then we want to adjust the horizontal scale as well. And if we go 5 down in the vertical, we need to go 5 up in the horizontal. So you can see he becomes sort of a chunky boy, but that's all right. Then we go 3 keyframes ahead and just copy and paste that first keyframe. Let's ease it by pressing F9. And here we really want to exaggerate the easing. So it has a lot of easing towards the start and end. So we can simply just drag these in like this. And that way it just happens a lot closer to when he's hitting the ground. Here it's before the animation, but we can just copy these 3 keyframes. And then we want it to happen again the next time he sort of hits the ground. So we can paste it and just drag it so we have it aligned here with the center keyframe. And then again for the last part here, and just align it with the center. So this way there's a bit of squash and stretch, and the animation just looks a bit more playful, and it just takes some of that impact away so the animation isn't that harsh. Then as a final touch, I've just animated the sweat. This is quite simple. I just took it and then I moved the anchor point to the top part of the sweat here. Then I created a scale animation so it scales up at the start and then scales down towards the end. And then using the Y position, I've just made it fall. So you can see it accelerates as it's falling and moves very quickly towards the end. So that way it just becomes visible and disappears again. So you can create a lot of variations with this. This is another one that I created. You can just see it tells a bit more of a story. He's running, and then basically I just have his head sort of turning. And the way that I did that is basically just by animating the X position of his visor. So it moves to the left as he's looking there. And then I just took his backpack and moved that a bit to the right. And then the sweat sort of drips down as he's turning because he sees something behind him that he's running away from. Now this is just a clever way to tell more of a story when using a run cycle. And as you can see, I just have the animation here at the start. We have everything. So the way that I looped it is that for the standard keyframes, I use this expression, which is loop in plus loop out minus value, which just means that it loops in. As you can see, we're missing a keyframe here, so it takes that from behind. And then afterwards, it just starts looping this sort of sequence. So for the path animation, that's a bit more difficult, But as you can see, that's just another expression that I used here that I got from motion design school, which is sort of used to loop the path animation, because you can't use loop in or loop out on that. Now in another version, I animated the guy with a knife. So the only difference here is really that I took sort of the knife and the hand, then I animated the hand to move up and down, and I just offsetted one keyframe from the sort of body position here, and that way you can see it sort of has this offset movement, and that just looks great in my opinion. Then I animated the rotation of the hand, so you can see it rotates back and forth, and also offset that with one keyframe. And then I basically just animated a null that controls the hand from within the body here, so it can move upwards, and he sort of gets ready to attack. And really, you can see that offsetting does quite a lot in this example, because if I were to take these keyframes and just drag them so they're not offset at all, this looks quite boring, and it's in sync with the body. So that's why I also use offsetting quite a lot when animating. Then as a final piece, I combined everything and got this result.
Why are you running?
So I just added the sort of sound effects and everything, made them run next to each other. And the way that I created this is that I just took the compositions where I have them running, and then I basically just took the X position and added an expression, and this is transform.x position plus time times 980. This just means that they're moving across the screen, as you can see here, instead of just standing still in the center and running. So this is just some compositing and just a way that you can create an interesting animation from the run cycles, because it can become quite boring if he's just running in the middle and there's no real story. So I always need some kind of storytelling when doing animation. So I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you learned something new. This is my first sort of character animation tutorial, so make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this and want more of it, and leave a comment down below and tell me what you want me to teach next, or if you have any issues with this tutorial in particular. If you create anything from this, make sure to share it with me on Instagram at Oliver Randorf, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to get notified when I upload future videos. That's all for now. Till next time.